Good afternoon, everyone. I'm June Rawl, and I'm so happy that you are able to share your Wednesday afternoon with us. Today, we're going to dive into using the GED Ready score report and some insights on how to drive instruction. Facilitating our webinar today is Daphne Atkinson. She's the Senior Director of State Relationships for GED Testing Service and comes to us today in Washington, D.C. Daphne, as we strive every day to increase our graduation rates. So using the GED Ready score report to the full potential is really some really great insights that we're going to get from you today. And I'm really excited about that. But before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping rules with you. You know that your attendee microphones are muted. You can interact with us today, and the way you'll do that is through the Q&A section of your screen. You type in your question or your comment there, and we'll be monitoring those comments and those questions throughout the webinar and addressing them to accommodate what you need. I want to remind you that today's webinar is being recorded, and your record of attendance today is also recorded and can be found in your IPDAY portal account under the activity history. So with all that being said, I'm going to now turn it over to Daphne so we can get started on how to use the GED score report to its full potential. Daphne, thank you so much for facilitating our webinar today.
June, I am so delighted to be here this afternoon, and thank you to everybody who is on the webinar. I'm delighted to bring some insights, hopefully, to help you step up your game with ensuring that students are ready to tackle the GED test content areas, particularly RLA and Social Studies, successfully. The session's objectives are really straightforward. We're going to analyze some real GED Ready score reports. We're going to explore the why and how of using score reports, particularly because they can be some very robust prescriptions to drive instruction and hopefully share some ideas and resources. So I want to start by, asking a rhetorical question. How do you use score reports? In the old days of the 2002 series test, when you got a score report, the only thing of any note for you to pay attention to was, did the person meet the minimum, or was that person exceeding the minimum score on one of the 5 content areas? Well, in the world we live in now, these score reports have invaluable information for you. But we still have people who still want to focus on the score only. For example, because the cut score for passing is at 145, we want to look at, well, is it 145 or higher, or did they just miss it? Another way that score reports have been used is to get a sense of what kind of work needs to be done, and that in terms of skill building and content knowledge. And sometimes you have the benefit of having not only the GED Ready, but you also may have students who have decided to gamble and take an operational test or two. So that gives you an opportunity to have 2 sets of test results, the GED Ready test results, as well as the operational test results. And it isn't by accident that those score reports are virtually identical, because we do want the comparisons to be able to be made. And then there are still others who don't use the score report, who consider the feedback a bit too generic. It is general if you don't select the publisher materials that your program is using or the student has used to prepare. If you click the publishers, you will get a very detailed prescription in terms of where to find the topic areas that the student needs to work on. So compared with the old days where it was a score only and the only thing you were focused on was, did it meet the minimum, which in the 2002 series was 410. But, quite honestly, what you really cared about, if you remember, we had a compensatory scoring model. So you really had to, among your 5 tests, you had to have a 2250 to actually earn a credential. Complicated for everybody. This is much better, much simpler, and easier both for you as instructors and students to manage. So that being said, how can you get your students to the victory lap of not only passing, but going on and credentialing? So how do you get there? And this is one of my favorite parts, and that is a call to action for you. 3 steps, very simple: review, diagnose, and prescribe. And let's take a look at how that looks. So at the review phase, you're going to categorize the feedback. And I know, and I'll show some real score reports. They are, of course, de-identified, and no, they are not from any test takers who tested in Florida. You're going to see a lot of feedback, but don't get confused or dismayed by the sheer number of items. As you read through them, you'll be able to categorize them in bigger umbrella categories, which will suggest things that you could pursue effectively with the student to begin to close the skill gaps. Make sure that as you review, you're being concrete. How does this feedback translate into what I'm doing in the classroom? And last but certainly not least, make the connections. You may get a lot of descriptive copy on the score report, but usually they're associated with a specific skill, and you'll see that in the slides I'm going to present in a few minutes. The second step is to diagnose. What is it that the feedback is suggesting about the student's performance? There are usually, in student performance, there are usually some consistent themes, and you may even discover that there are consistent themes among and between the students in your program or in your classes. So this step is an important one for how you're going to do the next thing, which is to prescribe. What is it in terms of learning experiences that has the student got to experience in order for improvement to occur? At this point, I want to make sure I say that students feel that, okay, I didn't do well on the GED Ready. My solution is to take more GED Ready. No, actually, you want to discourage them from doing that because that's not a way to learn content, number one. And number two, all they do is to become proficient at taking the GED Ready. And the skill building that we all know drives performance doesn't happen. So you really want to discourage them from, testing repeatedly on GED Ready. Now, I understand that you can't control what they do away from your classroom, but I think that you can make a persuasive argument to them to not simply do one practice test after another, because that's not changing the learning dynamic and the skill dynamic enough for them to be successful. As you can see, the enhanced score report, I've grayed out the GED test, but you can see they're still in the same categories. What we found with a piece of research that our cognitive researchers did was to actually, we have some eye tracking software, and if that sounds a little bit like 1984, that's kind of a kind of bittersweet reality. But there's some eye tracking software that allows the researchers to see, when shown a score report, where is it that the I goes first, and where does it go subsequently? And not surprisingly, I'm sure to anybody sitting in on this webinar, that the first place people's eye goes is to the score. In the GED Ready, it's going to indicate whether the person scored in the likely to pass range, the too close to call range, or not likely to pass range. The second piece is how I can score higher. This is the place where the feedback occurs on the skills that the test taker still needs to work on, and includes a personalized study plan, which I talked about, that has the pages and chapters to review once you select the publisher and of the materials that you're using. You know, what my score means is really a reassurance piece for the students. It explains what skills the student has successfully demonstrated on the practice test. And for RLA, I know that many students don't actually print out this part, but you want to encourage them. For the RLA, there's the written responses to the extended response. Those are contained there. And so this is a place where, particularly for RLA, if students are not writing enough, if students are not writing on topic, if they are demonstrating a lack of skill at organizing their thoughts, this is where you can actually see and diagnose those things. So the score report, again, yes.
Oh, Daphne, on that note, we have an instructor that's just commenting about that she found it very beneficial to show the student their sample that they used on the response. And she's saying that what she does is she edits it together with the students and then works on the skills needed to address the weaker language areas.
That is so perfect. Kudos to the instructor who's doing that. That is exactly what we want you to do in terms of seeing what the student wrote, and identifying and working with them, you know, through rewriting. Because after all, even on the operational test, the constructed response is what we call on-demand draft writing. It does not have to be perfect, but there are some things that if students are sensitized to and have enough practice at, they can be much more successful, we believe, than many of them have been to date with the extended response. Okay, so at this point, thank you for that, June. We're going to talk a little bit about what instructors need to know and what some of the resources are for success. I think that I'm going to just bring up all of these. You know, clearly, the RLA test is an integrated test. It's a vast improvement over the 2002 series, where we had a reading test and a writing test. So this is an integrated test in terms of that, and it does require a level of skill and proficiency in close reading, clear writing, and being able to edit and understand, you know, standard written English. There's a little bit of an intentional bias in terms of source text. 75% nonfiction, and read that mostly informational text, the kinds of things that people would be reading at in the workplace, in a job training program, or in other post-secondary endeavors. But fiction is not left out of it. It's about 25%. You might I want to highlight the fact that the passage length is much more significant than it was on the 2002 series test. Passage length starts at 400 words, goes up to 900. And there's a mix of passages in terms of, you know, some of the shorter ones can be more complex in terms of the ideas under discussion, and the 900-word ones could be simpler in terms of both concept and structure. So there's not a direct correlation that the 900-word passages are by default going to be the most complex. They may be for readers who are not actually reading within the high school equivalency range. But it also does include some text at the college and career readiness level. And because this is, after all, a test that actually can measure 4 different performance levels. And of course, there are some technology enhanced items. We use those kinds of items, drag and drop, for asking students to sequence some events. We may use a drop down to invite them to edit a sentence or part of a paragraph. So we make use of both of those things. I also want to make sure that I say that there are some very good changes that many of you as instructors have wished and hoped for over the last couple of years. Starting in January, and we have a webinar on the Tuesdays for Teachers webinar archive that talks about the changes coming to the RLA screens. And they're all good changes. They're not anything to be anxious about. The screen layouts are going to be redone. The tiny box that students were asked to input their answers in is becoming half of the real estate, so that they can have a better sense of how much they've written, because we did find in the research we did that the size of the box was subtly influencing how much students wrote. And no matter how many times we told you and you told them that the box's capacity was infinite, it led to their underwriting by several hundred words. And when we tested the new layouts, interestingly enough, students actually pretty much doubled, and in some case tripled, the writing output because they could see how much they were writing. So, if you haven't had a chance to do that, I would suggest that you go to GED.com on the educator side, go to the webinar archive and pull up the webinar that we just did on the changes to the RLA screens. And I think that you'll agree, if you aren't familiar yet with the changes that have been proposed, I think that you will find them to be welcome changes. So I wanted to highlight that momentarily. So
Daphne,
here is...
I'm
yes.
sorry, Daphne, did you say those changes were in January or June? We have a question.
No, January.
January.
They will begin in January.
Okay, okay, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead.
No, and then you were going to say something more about that change. That the question was just January or June.
Right. I mean, what happens is that over the usually the winter break, the last week or two in December, when testing is, for a lot of reasons, at an all-time low, that's usually when we introduce the new test forms for 2019. And I wanted to also make sure that I said that this new layout with the screens will be both in the operational test, and it will also be mirrored in the GED Ready. So they will see that layout in both tests.
Okay, and
that's what I want.
Perfect. That leads to another question. Can you just briefly describe the operational test and the GED Ready test? We're having a comment about what is an operational test.
Okay, that's the real deal that you go and take at the test center. That is the GED Ready test is an indicator of whether someone has the skills to tackle the operational test and it's their likelihood to pass. That is what the Ready test is. It's a readiness indicator of high school equivalency. And so it has 3 zones likely to pass, too close to call, and not likely to pass. So the last one, not likely to pass, is red zone. The yellow zone, which is where we're going to focus our attention today, is too close to call. And then the green zone is the folks that are scoring in the passing zone. And the GED Ready is actually a half-length test. It was normed and standardized the same way as the 4 content area tests that make up, quote, the GED test. I hope that answers the question.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so this is a GED Ready score report, and this was someone who scored in the too close to call range. And why am I spending time on the too close to call range? Well, I'm spending time on that because that's the one that really impels a lot of students to take a gamble. And sometimes that gamble might be justified, but more often than not, which I'll show you in the example that I have here for RLA and Social Studies, more likely than not, that student needs a little bit more work before they undertake sitting for the real reasoning through language arts test. So this individual scored a 139. And you were looking at that section of the score report that I indicated was the place where you get the feedback on the scores that you need to improve. So it's under a tab that's called How I Can Score Higher. And so what you get is a category, and in this case, it's reading for meaning, and then there are 2 columns. There is a skill you can improve, and you'll see, as I mentioned a few slides earlier, the publisher study recommendations are in that second column. So you select, there's a drop-down menu, you select whichever study materials that you're using either in your program or the student is using, and it will populate with the chapters, the pages, the sections that are most relevant to developing those skills. And as you can see in the reading for meaning category, there are a number of items. Analyze how details develop the main idea. That presumes that people have a very good idea of the structure of paragraphs and how do you elicit information from how things are structured. Analyze how the organization of a paragraph or passage supports the author's ideas. Infer, something that our students in the GED pipeline don't like as much because they're afraid of being wrong for the most part. Infer, because inferring requires the intersection of really great reading skills, being able to read between the lines. It's not guessing, which many students believe that inferring is, well, I'm going to guess about that. No, actually, you are operating on tangible clues that are embedded in the structure of the reading. Understand the use of words, phrases, or figurative language. Make inferences about plot, sequence of events, characters, settings, etc. And as you can see from this really requires a fair amount of skill or proficiency as a reader. The second piece is identifying and creating arguments. This part, understand main ideas and details. That's the structure of the writing. Being able to determine the main idea. Again, being conversant with structure so that you can identify those things. Identify the relationship between the main idea and the details. This is all about, these things all are what constructive response or extended response revolve around. Being able to identify the evidence used to support a claim or conclusion. That again presumes that you can actually analyze and literally dissect a paragraph to pull out all the details that make the paragraph a unit and extract the information that the information that's needed. And so then you'll see that there's another section that involves additional skills to work on. And those things, those things are the things that push the student from too close to call over into the green zone. So you're really strengthening the skills and then applying them to text in a consistent way. Because for the most part, what we've seen with folks who are in the yellow zone is that they have some skill, but they don't usually use it consistently. And so the task in the classroom is to build off that foundation, strengthen it, and then add on to it so that the student can tackle the RLA successfully. Okay, so here's what I did, by way of, simplifying things. Because, okay, that's a lot of text. And if I'm a student and I come to you as an instructor and say, look, here's my score report. And, it seems like I have all these things to work on. Well, one of the ways that you can help them is to think and help, drive what you do in the classroom is to begin to categorize, bring those details up a level, to a bigger category. And if I look at the reading for meaning category, for example, it's really all about close reading. Being able to pay attention to the details, the structural fine points of how the main idea is not only stated, but developed and built out. To actually know by reading between the lines what you can and cannot infer from what's actually said. Students have considerable ability to understand what's explicitly stated, but what is implicit, again, inference, comes a little bit harder. But all students really do know how to infer. They just need practice so they can be consistent with it. And the inference skill is, pretty important. And most people have a fairly developed inferential skill already. They just need to learn how to direct it and use it as far as written text is concerned. Okay, so here's the diagnosis in terms of determining what's missing. Close reading skills are needed here. The ability to engage with text, and what we have is when readers are not proficient at reading, their ability to engage with the text is limited. And what instructionally you're called to do is to push them beyond that so that they can notice, they can wander, they can question, they can relate and think about this, and on occasion, even argue with the text. If you think about yourself as a reader, almost all of us who are proficient and competent readers, we have a rich, engagement with the text that may be asking yourself a million questions. I know that I am in dialogue with everything I read. Well, I wonder why they use this word. Well, this structure doesn't make sense to me because it sort of undercuts the argument that you're making over here. Those are the kinds of things that proficient and competent readers do instinctively and may need work in readers who are not as proficient. And so those things, I see how I took the score report feedback and I literally tracked it back, to a diagnosis. So the other areas for improvement, identifying and creating argument. Well, this is someone who needs a refresher in the classic text structures, which provides a really great shortcut for understanding, is this compare and contrast? Is this description? Is this cause and effect? Those are some of the common text structures that all students should be actually acquainted with. In terms of evidence, being able, we found that students have become fairly proficient at extracting evidence from the text, but they don't necessarily know how to use that evidence to support the argument they say is better supported. So that's it. And then last but certainly not least, I was an English major in college, so I'm really big on grammar. You know, the plea I would make to this audience is, you know, bring grammar much closer to the writing task, because when you try to teach grammar as a separate thing, students do not bring their grammar heads into the writing task because they think it is some disaggregate thing that happens over here and not something that should be governing their writing. So that's just a word to the wise, and we often see that in scores in this range. You know, again, the needs development things, not surprisingly, inferences. Again, if you work on the close reading, you can extend that to incorporate the inference. And again, being able to identify the specific pieces of evidence that the author uses to support the claims and conclusions. So, you know, in addition to building some close reading skills, the test taker needs to work with text structures, and these are the most common ones. In particular, sequence, problem and solution, compare and contrast, and cause and effect are probably the most useful ones to emphasize. And along with those text structures, you know, introduce the students to the notion of signal words. There are sets of words that literally convey, oh, this is a cause and effect. Oh, this is a compare and contrast. Help them, you know, become comfortable with those words so that they can actually drop into the structures much more easily. And as far as evidence is concerned, it's not just about getting a broader definition of what evidence is, but it's to be able to use the evidence to support the position they're taking. Often they will write about the evidence, but not why this piece of evidence supports the claim that they are saying is the stronger claim. So not only the evidence, but why this evidence and how does it support the claim that the author is making. Those are the two disconnects that are still part of the student performance landscape. You know, just to you know, summarize that, proficient readers and writers. I mean, you know, the connection, and I know everyone that's here on this webinar understands the connection between reading and writing. It's two sides of the same coin. It's why we have an integrated test now, because it isn't two separate things. It's really, you know, as I said, two sides of the same coin. And when readers and writers are proficient, they can attack complex text. They are attuned to the text structure. They know to look for the key words and phrases. They know how to unpack the prompt in terms of what am I being asked to do, and how am I being asked to do that. They can develop a claim or argument. They can also find the evidence that supports the claim, analyze and evaluate. One of the, you know, just as a side note, one of the things the researchers found was when they asked students about analysis, more often than not, students said, oh, that means to read. And no, it's more than reading when you are called to analyze. And to explain how, as I said earlier, the evidence is connected to the claim or the argument. I also wanted to make sure on this webinar I addressed the fact that many instructors have said to us, but the feedback doesn't tell us what questions were missed. No, and actually you really don't need to know what specific questions were missed. What you need to know about is the skills that are needed to develop, to earn that higher score. And, you know, yes, we're asking you to infer what's needed based on what wasn't demonstrated. And again, as I said a few minutes ago, we're really talking about consistency. It's not that people, test takers and students, don't know this. You know, it's a complete blank slate. What it is that they sort of memorized a routine, and if there's a slight departure from that routine, then they don't necessarily recognize it is actually the thing that you know, and you can actually use this. And so that's why this is a reasoning test, not a regurgitation, as many of us, in K-12 when we were students, it was, unzip our heads and pour the knowledge in, and then you go to test and you regurgitate. That's not what this is. And, having the answers to, having the specific questions that were missed in front of you doesn't really help, but knowing what skills were not demonstrated or were inconsistently demonstrated can tell you, a boatload of things. So that's the pitch here. So, how do we get, the biggest bang for the buck, as it were, with the available time? Track this feedback back to the high impact indicators, which are actually on the website. Use the performance level descriptors, specifically level 1 and level 2, which is, the first one is not passing, and the second one is the high school equivalency level. And also remember to have students review the study guide. There's a study guide on the student portion of GED.com for each of the content areas, and it gives a marvelous, very, compact overview of the kinds of things that you need to make sure you know coming into the RLA test. And it gives students some reassurance that really you don't have to know everything, but there are some basic things that you should have a command of going into the test. And these are just some of the things that you might want to use as checklists. The high impact indicators help you understand, what the indicator is, what some of the sub indicators are, and what you should expect to see in student work when the student has mastered that skill, and is consistent with being able, to access that particular skill. This is a page from, my GED study guide. What I love about this is it's really a great overview. You should be familiar with reading and writing concepts, the same things I just went over with you, along with grammar. You'll need to read and understand the passages, both literary and informational. And you can see this is written in a pretty accessible tone for the vast majority of students. And the third point, meant for a bit of reassurance, you don't need to know everything in the guide. And those are the really three critical reasons why I included this in the presentation. Is it's a really, simple, clean way to get students thinking about what it is they need to commit to be able to tackle this successfully. So June, at this point, I'm going to ask, are there any questions out there?
Daphne, I think you're going to love this comment, and I think you should take it back to people at GED Testing Service. The comment is, I love, love, love the new study guides. I'm asking my students to build vocabulary summaries from some of the terminology that they may not understand.
Fabulous.
So
I am delighted to, I will take that back. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about our Too Close to Call test taker. This was a student who decided to take a gamble on their 139 Too Close to Call GED Ready score and actually took the RLA test and scored a 137, which was completely in line with the feedback that the person received from the GED Ready exam. And the RLA test, what I call the operational exam, included the same categories that we just walked through for the GED Ready test. And there weren't any surprises because, again, this is a half-length test, but it is highly predictive of performance. 139 on the GED Ready, on the real RLA test, 137. It's exactly what we would have anticipated the result to be. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to move on and speak to the social studies. And the reason why these are paired together is there's a considerable overlap in the skills. The context is different, but the same skills are being deployed in both RLA and in social studies. These are the characteristics of the social studies test. It's 50% civics and government, 20% U.S. history, 15% economics, and 15% geography and the world. Two organizing themes, the development of modern liberties and democracy and dynamic responses in societal systems. That just, gives coherence across the content coverage. And the social studies practices, not unlike reasoning through language arts, analyzing, thinking, reasoning. And we make the same use of technology-enhanced items. In this case, the score was a 137. It was another yellow zone, too close to call. Not surprisingly, there's a reading for meaning in social studies, using details to make inferences or claims, comparing information that differs between sources. Again, I'm going to track back momentarily to the RLA, compare and contrast in text structures. If you've got that skill down pat from RLA, you can bring it lock, stock, and barrel to social studies. Determine the difference between fact and opinion. That's another example of compare and contrast. In addition, what evidence supports an inference? Analyze cause and effect relationships. If you remember, cause and effect is one of the key text structures for students to master, and describe the connections between people, places, environments, processes, and events. Again, cause and effect, problem and solution. Again, students tend to want to put numerical skills in silos. And, most obviously, if it's numbers, it has to do with math. But actually, in social studies, we have numbers and graphs as part of the social studies landscape. So some of the skills that are numeracy and number sense are invaluable here in social studies as well. So being able to analyze information from maps, tables, charts, etc., interpret and use and create graphs. So math is not the only, mathematical reasoning is not the only place where you use those concepts. So there are some additional skills, and there are quite a few. And then, but again, all of those skills can be put in, big buckets. Inference, using the details, that that is one of the hallmarks of inference. It's not guessing. It's not a blind shot in the dark. There's a trail of breadcrumbs in virtually every passage that can help people get to a reasonable inference. Analyzing historical events and arguments in social studies. We're talking about the evidence that supports an inference, being able to identify bias and propaganda. I mean, those are things that are essential skills for adults in our information-rich age. Students often think that there's some police of the internet that makes sure that what goes up is, valid content. Well, we all know better than that. There is no police of the internet on the accuracy. And every time I hear someone say, it must be true because I saw it on the internet, I kind of cringe because, we do need to get across to, folks, the ability to make those kinds of calls, analyzing cause and effect, and being able to describe the connections between people, places, and environments. And that's something that we have found from the inception of the 2014 test, that students have really wrestled with making those vital connections and being able, to respond to questions that revolve around things like cause and effect, problem, and solution. We talked about the graphs and numbers in social studies. It's an essential. And math does have a role not only in mathematical reasoning, but in science and social studies as well. And so we have a challenge in terms of getting students to not silo skills related to specific content areas. This is a highly integrated test, and the skill sets are transferable across all of the content areas. And this, again, talks about the skills that need developing, being able, to pick out the details in primary and secondary sources, and use that information in order to make logical inferences, emphasis on the word logical, and valid claims. In much the same way as in reasoning through language arts, being able to determine the central ideas, being able to determine the meaning of words and phrases that are used in a social studies context, the difference between fact and opinion in either a primary or a secondary source document. These skills, I included this list so that you can see how transferable between the content areas these skills are. And the big thing is you've got to be a really competent reader, and that doesn't shut the door on people who are not, but they are going to have a commitment to build their reading skills, a personal commitment, because you simply don't have all the class time hours, to tackle all of this and reading too. And the only way a reader who is not proficient becomes a proficient reader is by committing to a personal practice away from the classroom. And I want to add that doesn't have to start with, you go home and read for 3 hours. It begins simply with having someone read for 10 minutes, and gradually let them up the time that they spend concentrating on reading. Some of you who may have gone to some of the workshops that I have done in Florida and elsewhere know that I have often said, if you show me a good writer, I'll show you somebody who's also a good reader. And those words stand true and ring true. Those of you who are struggling with readers who aren't good readers often find they are also not good writers. And it's infectious because good, if you read good things, it's like a viral infection. You sort of internalize some of those. And it's particularly important because of the link between reading and writing. And if you understand how that those words wound up on a page by intention, that there's a structure, there were deliberate decisions made about the vocabulary and everything else, you can get students to that place. You can actually unlock a dynamic reader, without exception, I would say. So these are just the numerical skills that appear in social studies, much to the surprise of students. It's the same kind. They're the same kinds of skills you would find in mathematical reasoning tests as well as the science test. So those things are quite useful. So the diagnosis here is that close reading is needed. The ability to be able to sort through the text and extract the important details, being able to engage with social studies text, and developing from a rudimentary to a fairly, solid set of inference skills. And here, just so that you can see the relationship, this is the high impact indicators and the relationships between them. Here's one that the top one in the diagram is from reasoning through language arts. Then you see social studies, and then you see science. So all of it is a related set of skills that once learned, students can transfer and deploy them across the content area. A couple of words about inference. It's process driven, and it involves questioning, thinking critically, and making connections. It is the perfect storm in terms of a skill to get students to learn how to exercise really well. One of the ways we often think that we want to present, the most complex case, and you want to start with the simple. You want to start with things like pictures and ads, and then move to the longer, more intricate passages as you pass through each of these phases. And then by chunking it this way, you start where most people will be able to extract the obvious, so that it kind of empowers them to move forward into the more complex. Here's a quick example of teaching with comics. And I come from the school of by any means necessary to engage students. So this is kind of a really cute one. If you look at what do you see a door that has culinary school written on it. You see a gentleman in a chef's hat. You see a student who is clutching his hat in his hand, saying to the chef, "I ate my homework." That's just what you see. So the inference is that he had a dish to make as a homework assignment, and he consumed it instead of bringing it to school so that it could be graded. And so the sample questions that you might ask about that is, what do you see? What do you know about excuses for not having your homework or your assignments done? And then what does the student mean when he says, "I ate my homework"? So you can start with something as simple as that to bring home the whole concept. Our test taker decided to roll the dice and move forward with taking the social studies test, and he scored a 134. And actually, the identical items that were identified in his GED Ready score are the same items that were identified in his social studies test test score report where he received 134. And again, totally consistent with, with the skills that were highlighted in the GED Ready score report. So at this point, we're almost to time. And so I just wanted to leave you with a question for reflection for you and also for your colleagues. What are the key ingredients in skill development? As you look at the score reports, kind of spending some time thinking about that. What is it that can happen in the classroom in terms of activities that can engage students who are struggling with reading, writing, and critical thinking? Because engagement in the adult ed classroom, as you all know, is critical. And then what are the most effective ways to bring these elements to life in the classroom? And many of you are already doing many of those things. Be sure to share. One of the last things I want to leave you with is that help students understand that too close to call means on the GED Ready that you might need to do some additional work before you can earn a passing score on the real test. And I would ask you to be open to the idea and make sure that you get students to understand there's more than one right way to do virtually anything. That kind of flexibility in thinking will serve them well in life. The third point is for you, that I would love it for classroom interactions to be one and done, but the truth is it's not. And if that were true, we would have legions of experts. And the last piece is just a reminder to be gentle with yourself, that, you have to flow with the plateaus, as it were, because learning and skill development, I would wish that they were linear, but they're not. And we have to have the patience as, our adult students wrestle with internalizing and being able to execute against this skill portfolio. So with that, I want to turn it back over to June, and I want to thank you for being on this call. And June, it's your show.
Daphne, thank you so much. This was really some valuable information. I want to let you know that the presentation will be on the IPDAY website, so if you were unable to download it, you can pick it up there. But before we end today, we just need a few more minutes of your time to answer these 3 short survey questions, which now appear on your screen. If you could take some time to answer those questions, we would appreciate it. And in a last minute comment while you're answering those questions, I just want to let you know that the next webinar, which is scheduled for October 24th, is going to address a lot of the things that Daphne talked about today. So this webinar, Plot the Course, Understanding Text Features and Structures in Nonfiction. This webinar is really going to focus on text structures and how to build these skills at different reading levels. So it's really going to help out a lot with some of the information that Daphne gave us today. So the poll is now closed. And again, I thank you so much for sharing your Wednesday with us, and I wish you a great rest of the day.